Hey everyone, Pastor Tim here, back with you again. As you can see, we're in the outdoor studio today, and we're in week 2 in our study of the book of James and in our study of learning how to investigate and study the Bible. So in this week, what we're going to do is recap a little bit of what we talked about last week and then continue digging into the book of James together. So last week we started off by talking about how to study the Bible, taking these 5 different steps. Okay, so let's recap on those. Step number 1 is figuring out where is the book I'm studying fitting into the Bible timeline. Is it at the beginning of the Bible? Is it toward the end of the Bible? Step number 2 is getting some background on the actual book. Who's the author? When was it written? Why was it written? And then the next 3 steps are observe, interpret, apply. Observe the information in the passage. Interpret it. What does it mean to the people who it was written to back then? And then apply it to my life today. What truths can I pull out of that passage that apply to me today? Now, I want to add a couple more pieces of information to this. First off, I want to note that if you're studying a passage and you get to the interpretation portion and you go, I really don't know what this means. I really don't know how to understand this section of the scripture, that's totally fine. Just because you can't have the interpretation in that moment doesn't mean you'll never have the interpretation. So you can just put that aside and maybe in the future do some more research. Don't feel like you have to master every single section of the passage that you're looking at. If you say, I don't know what it means, that's totally fine. That's an opportunity to learn more in the future. The other thing is, as you interpret and apply, that's where the interaction can be really, really interesting in a small group, because someone could say, well, as I read this, I think this section of the passage means X. And then you might say, yeah, I think it means X, but I think it's also speaking to Y as well, right? So you work together as a group to draw the proper interpretation out. One thing to note about interpretation is that scripture will never contradict scripture. So if you think that a passage means one particular thing, but you know in another section of the Bible it says something totally different, well, then you probably have to reinterpret the passage that you're looking at. So scripture will never contradict scripture. The last thing I want to throw out to you is that this process is meant to be a tool and not to be totally restrictive. Now, when I say that, what I mean is don't just go through, okay, I've observed, now I interpret, now I imply, check the box, leave small group, leave Bible study. What I want you to do is to wrestle with the application, wrestle with the interpretation. Okay, now that we understand what this means, what does it mean for my life? I'll give you an example. So last week, as I was looking at this opening section of the book of James, one of the words that was used was master, describing God as master. So that was an observation. The interpretation, obviously, is that God is the master. He's the one in charge of my life and of the whole universe. But now an application is more than just saying, I need to live like God is my master. Okay, now I need to dig into that. Okay, where are areas that I don't seem to want to let God be my master? What are areas where I'm willing to let him be master? Maybe I talk to somebody and say, hey, what do you see in my life where I need to submit to God as master more? That's where we dig in deeper when it comes to that application of something that we've interpreted and understood from the text. All right, so let's jump back into the scripture now. We're in James chapter 1, starting in verse 19, and we're going to go all the way down to the end of chapter 1, and that'll wrap up at verse 27. So what I'm going to do this week is continue to take us through that observation, interpretation, and then application. But I'm going to do a little bit less this week so that you can do even more in the study, right? So let me just read this section, which closes out chapter 1 from James. It says this: My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because our anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and all the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Those who listen to the word do not do what it says are like people who look at their faces in a mirror and, after looking at themselves, go away and immediately forget what they look like. But those who look intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continue in it, not forgetting what they have heard, but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. Those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues, deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. So we're starting in verse 19, we're going down to verse 27. Let me throw out some of my observations, and then I'll throw out some interpretations, and then maybe one application. And then I want you to go into this exact same text and dig into it a bit. First off, I want you to notice that right at the beginning, here's an observation. James says, take note of this. And then it has a colon, like, okay, pay attention. Here comes the line I'm going to drop. So it must be really important when he says, take note of this. So there's an observation that James is going to really hit us with something really important. He talks obviously about carrying out, living out the word, not just hearing it. But then he also talks about this idea of keeping a tight rein on the tongue. So an observation is there's the doing, there's the learning, and there's also the speaking. James is bringing all of those things up. Verse 27 I love because it uses the word religion. And sometimes in church world, people can say, well, it's not about religion, it's about relationship. But here's an observation. James uses the word religion, and he describes it in this way: religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless. So my observation right there is that religion is obviously not a bad thing if James is describing it in this way. And so he gives us a proper interpretation of what religion is. So in this section, we're seeing some clear directives from James about things he wants people to do. Just big observation about this. It's about action. And so much of the book of James has these calls to action. All right, so again, I'm not going to do a ton of observation because I want you to have a chance to do that in your groups. Here's a quick interpretation as we go to that verse 27. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, colon. Again, the definition, here's the definition. I'm about to give it to you, colon. Okay, whatever he says next is going to be really important. He says, to look after orphans and widows in their distress. Okay, that's the first thing. So clearly, pure religion in God's eyes is taking care of people in distress. Now that says orphans and widows, but I think it means broadly people who are lacking, people who are in need. Yes, orphans and widows, but in general, people who have needs that I can actually help address. But then he goes on as he continues to describe that pure religion. He says, and to keep oneself being polluted by the world. So again, there's action and then there's internal stuff. I got to love orphans and widows, take care of orphans and widows. And then in my own soul, in my own being, I got to make sure I'm not being polluted by the world. So let me give you an application to my life right here. When I look at that section and I say, there's a type of religion that's pure, it's beautiful, it's wonderful, it's what God desires. And part of that is taking care of orphans and widows. Here's my application for me is to say, am I taking care of orphans and widows? Now, does that mean I have to take care of all of them all the time? Obviously, that's not possible. But then there's a challenge for me. Am I engaging with people who've lost a spouse? Am I engaging for those who don't have parents? By the circumstances of my job, I have a chance to marry people and also bury people. And so in the last handful of years, I've had a chance to walk with a couple people who've lost spouses. And so this is a challenge to me to continue to do that because that is God's heart and I want to live in line with God's heart. So there's a direct application from the scripture to my life, a challenge to say, hey, don't forget about those people who've lost a spouse. Keep loving and blessing and encouraging them. All right, so what I want you to do now is to shut the video down and go into that process, looking at those same verses, and as a group, go through and observe things, what jumps out to you, go through the interpretation process and say, okay, in light of what we observe, what does it mean? And then move into some time of reflection and really discussion. Okay, how do I apply sections of this scripture or this entire section to my life? Ask those questions like, what are the key words? Are there repeated words? Are there key people? Are there really strong concepts being put forward? Are there questions that come up in the passage or as I read it that I don't understand certain things? And so maybe I should jot that down and dig into that in the future. And remember, when it comes to interpretation, what we want to do is we want to say, what did this mean to the people to whom it was written first? And then we can draw later out application to our lives. We don't want to say, yeah, that was written originally for me. No. Originally it was written for somebody else. And now we get to look into what God has shared with them through James. And then we say, okay, some of those truths are timeless and we can apply it to our lives. Thanks for engaging in this process as we continue to learn how to study scripture and delve into the book of James. And I hope it's blessing you. This is an exciting process for me to study this way and to share this way of studying with you. So blessings, and we'll see you soon.